G'day, George here. This might be of interest to you if you own a BMW GS motorcycle, particularly one of the later versions, kind of 2014 onwards. I just ran an experiment in cahoots with a good friend of mine, Al Samuels from Race Dynamics down in New South Wales here in Australia. And what we wanted to understand was the type of job, the quality of the work that BMW had done when they'd set up these particular bikes that have got the electronic damping and the electronic preload settings for the rear. And basically it was the quality of the work they'd done in setting up that preload setting, because these particular bikes, and in this case this is the 2015-2016 model R1200GS triple black version, and these particular bikes, right, they come with the option of dynamic suspension settings, and that includes an electronic preload setting where you can set the bike at the rear end to cater to one rider plus luggage, or two riders. And what we wanted to understand was the relationship between the preload and the SAG results and how that impacted, where the bike sat within the expected travel of the suspension at the rear end. And, it was pretty interesting to find out that BMW, had done an extraordinarily good job in setting it up in a way that we would set up manually to get the best ride and performance out of that suspension at the rear end. So if you look at the screen here, I'll just explain the way that we ran it. The rear end of an R1200GS 2015-2016 model has 200 millimeters of travel at the axle. So that wheel can go up and down 200 millimeters. So what you see on the screen is, on the left-hand side, just a measurement scale. It's got 20 10 millimeter increments, and on the right-hand side you've got the blue box, which indicates the 200 mil of travel. Now, if we were to break it into thirds, the mid-third of the suspension travel, this would be the sweet spot. So ideally the suspension runs or operates within that mid-third, particularly when you're going over bumps and around corners and that type of thing, because at one end it's too far up, and at the other end it's too closer to the wheel. So that's affecting steering and handling and the amount of load that's on the tyre and that type of thing. So it's commonly held belief or teaching that the optimum spot is in the mid-third of the travel of the suspension. Now, the point, if you've got, when you set the preload or the SAG on these particular bikes, the ideal place to have it when you sit on the bike as a rider, and we would call that rider SAG, is about the top of the mid-third. So it's at that first third point. And what that means is, if the bike has sagged to about that point within its travel as you ride along, as you hit bumps and as you go around corners and you get the G-force effect where it starts to compress the suspension, it's pushing the bike into the mid-third of the suspension. So anything in that area there would be pretty good in terms of a SAG setting with a rider sitting on the motorcycle. Now, in the first instance, we ran it with the one rider preload setting at the rear. And what we found with these measurements, the length of the spring was 195 millimeters. The extended length, and this is determined by where we measured from, right? And we needed to show this so you understand how the extended length actually changed as we changed the preload. The extended length that we measured was 447 millimeters. The static sag, which is how much the bike compressed the suspension when it was taken off the center stand and just the weight of the bike was applied. And basically what that had resulted in was 38 millimeters of sag from the extended point. When we added a rider, it dropped down to 61 mil in total. So on the left-hand side, you'll see little arrows. The static sag, right, dropped or compressed the suspension down 38 millimeters, and when we put a rider on, it's compressed down to 61 millimeters. And you'll notice there that the compression of the suspension has positioned the travel of the suspension close to the top of the mid-third. So it's in a pretty good place for, in this particular case, an 80 kilogram rider. We then changed the setting and we went to one rider plus luggage, and what that resulted in was 10 millimeters of additional preload. So if you see look in the spring length there, it talks about 185 millimeters. So the spring length has now been compressed by 10 mil, and it's 185 millimeters long. But notice that the extended length, so what that means is when we've got the bike on the center stand with the wheel off the ground, the extended length has now gone out a millimetre, and this continued right through all the measurements. What that says to us is there's a top-out spring in this particular shock absorber. So, you know, the BMW GS is not a cheap motorcycle, so you would expect it to have a fairly sophisticated suspension. Now, the static sag, when we set it to one rider plus luggage, is 13 millimetres, and then when we put one rider on it without any luggage, the rider sag goes down to 40 millimetres. So I would expect if they put on, you know, let's just say 20 or 30 kilograms of luggage, it would compress it further, and then it would get the rider sag closer to the top of the mid-third. So it's probably a pretty good setting there, considering we don't have any luggage on it at all in this particular case. Okay, we went to two rider setting. So in this particular case, two rider preload resulted in another or a further compression of the spring by another 10 millimetres. So the spring length is now 175 millimetres, and the extended length is 449. What that means is now as we're compressing it, right, there's a lot more pressure on the spring. It's got a top-out spring here that it's starting to overcome, and it's extending the length between the rear wheel and the frame. So the overall length, you know, in an extended situation with the wheel off the ground is longer. So as I said, that tells us we've got a top-out spring there. The static sag in this case is now only 6 mil, so that's the weight of the motorcycle. We put a rider on the bike, a single rider on the motorcycle, when it's got two rider preload, and we end up with 15 millimetres of rider sag. So it's interesting because notice where the position of the bike is with the rider sitting on it. It's way up the top there, so that means there's a lot of pressure on that spring, and the amount of force that it is applying, you know, to change direction and that type of thing is much greater at that particular point. So the bike would feel a lot heavier. Now, interestingly enough, I like riding it in that configuration if we're going for a, what you would recall a spirited ride up the range. I kind of like it because the bike has a bit more clearance, the back is lifted in the air, and the front end has a steeper rake, therefore it steers a lot quicker. So it's incredibly stable, but steers quicker, and I actually like riding it in that configuration if I want to push it pretty hard. But there you go, that's the results of the one rider sitting on the bike for the different preload settings. What we did to finish this off is we put a pillion on the bike with the rider, so we now got two people on it, and we wanted to see what the two rider preload did, because in a perfect world it would now go back to close to the top of the mid-third, and here's what we found. With two riders on it, in this case they weighed 80 kilos plus 65 kilos, so 145 kilos. We had a rider sag of 51 mil. Obviously the static sag is still the same, but the rider sag is now 51 mil, and it's getting closer to the top of that mid-third. So in that configuration, right, or that setting, a preload setting, it's very good for having the bike operate close to, if not, entirely in that mid-third of the suspension as the bike is riding over bumps and around corners and that type of thing. So in conclusion, BMW did an awesome job of determining what the preload settings were going to be and the spring tension and that type of thing for this particular motorcycle for riders of these weights, and hats off to them. You would expect that, considering it's a premium motorcycle. Now if you want the data, basically the data looks like this. That's the data that we collected. You can download it below. If you're on YouTube, there's a little button there. You click it, and you can download it as a PDF form if that's of interest to you. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed that. We found it extremely interesting, and it's just raised my confidence, tenfold in the work that BMW does in setting these suspensions up. So catch you in the next video. Bye.